All right, welcome everybody to the Warfighting Society's monthly virtual PME. And tonight our guest is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Leonard, United States Army retired. So a quick bio on the Colonel. He served as a United States Army infantry officer from 1979 to 2002. He's led units from platoon through battalion level. He served in Operation Desert Storm in a mechanized infantry task force. He was a combat developer at the Army's Infantry School and later helped coordinate the digital division exercises at Fort Hood. He's also trained as a war planner at the School of Advanced Military Studies and served as Chief of Plans for the 4th Infantry Division. With respect to his education, he's got a PhD in early United States history from West Virginia University, a Master of Arts in Military Arts and Sciences from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, a Master of Science in International Relations from Troy State University, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Columbus College. Where I learned about the Colonel was from his writings. He's written 3 really outstanding books on military theory, including The Art of Maneuver, Maneuver Warfare Theory and Airland Battle, Fighting by Minutes, Time and the Art of War, the Principles of War for the Information Age. He's also written numerous articles and essays, including Little Green Men, a primer on modern Russian unconventional warfare, Ukraine, 2013 to 2014. Colonel Leonard currently works at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, which sounds like a pretty cool place to work. He's been there since 2004, and he's done all sorts of interesting things, from designing war games for European Command to writing the Little Green Men essay I referenced earlier. So tonight he's going to be talking to us about the war in Ukraine, and we'll follow that with a Q&A. And without further ado, sir, over to you.
Thanks, Damien, and really thanks to the whole society for thinking of me and inviting me. This is and this is like Christmas. I love talking with folks just like you. I feel like I'm going to probably learn more tonight than any of you guys do. So I'm looking forward to discussion, debate, disagreement, and so on. So I'm going to try to once again share a screen. Let me know if that comes across okay. You should see PowerPoint. Is that? Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go over a quick chronology, and then we'll talk about some of the casualty rates. We'll talk about issues of tanks in warfare, and then I'm going to share some thoughts on what I think about the Russian performance and Ukrainian performance so far, and then just a comment or two on the strategic level of this thing, and then I want to reserve most of the time for discussion and questions, that kind of thing. So I want to use this map and talk over kind of the chronology. I got this is a map right off of Wikipedia, and I think it's a really good map. Kind of shows the major thrust lines of Russia so far. Now, there's a lot that we could talk about in terms of the run up to the war, starting back in back in the 1990s and then coming into the 2000s and the color revolutions and the Euromaidan incident and all that. I'm going to assume that you guys probably don't want to really emphasize that stuff. If you are interested in that, the work that we did at the lab on the Little Green Men primer talks a lot about that stuff. So in fact, it was really a lot of it is about the Euromaidan incident and Yanukovych being ousted and all that. So if you're interested in that, I'd recommend that essay. I wrote that with several of my colleagues at the lab, and they did some really good work. The version that you have is the unclassified version. The only difference in the classified version is that we had access to a really juicy set of diplomatic cables because one of the guys in the that was sponsoring that work was a former ambassador in Kiev, and he provided to us a whole bunch of diplomatic cables that we were able to scrutinize, and we added, because of that, there were some classification issues. So there is a classified version of that as well, but the unclassed version is pretty much, it's like 95% of everything we said in there. So I encourage you to read that if you're interested. But that brings us up to everything from 2014 forward, and as you know, coming out of that conflict in 2014, there were these Minsk protocols, two of them. They're interesting, but they really, they never really took. They never really meant much to Russia. It didn't really restrain Russia's behavior in any way. But as you move forward toward 2020, Ukraine is, especially with the emergence of Zelensky, they're moving, more confidently toward an integration with Western Europe. In 2019, the Ukrainian Rada actually passed legislation that stated explicitly their intention at some point to join EU and NATO. And of course, this is Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare. So in 2021, Russia began to do this massive buildup. And we've seen this kind of thing before, but in this case, it was a buildup, a long-term buildup, and it was moving, toward the Ukrainian border, all along the Ukrainian border. And what was remarkable was that as early as December 2021, U.S. intelligence, began to reveal publicly and very explicitly that Russia intended to invade Ukraine. And I thought this was brilliant. I really handed it to our administration for their handling of this, that they kept preempting and forestalling Russian disinformation by announcing ahead of time, okay, they're building up, they intend to invade, they're going to try a false flag operation claiming genocide and so forth. And if you were the guy in charge of Russian disinformation, this must have driven you crazy, because you can't get your message out before U.S. is already telling the world that it's fake. So I thought that was very well handled. But along with this, in 2021, the Russian, basically the equivalent of their national security advisor, Nikolai Khrushchev, is stating a doctrine that says, Russia reserves the right to intervene militarily along its borders, if there's anything that threatens the state. So, they're sort of, telegraphing their intent all along. But at the same time, they're continuing to deny that they have any intention of invading right up to the day that they actually did it. So, but in February of 2022, on the 21st of February, Russia recognizes Donetsk and Luhansk as separate, breakaway republics. Putin issues that very bizarre speech about his revisionist, concept of history, that Ukraine isn't really a nation, and all this sort of thing. And he's starting to drum up the Nazification issue. And again, I'd urge you to read Little Green Men if you're interested in that Nazi propaganda, because that's a really huge issue historically. I even heard him reference Bandera, Stepan Bandera, who is the infamous, Ukrainian nationalist that allied himself and cooperated with the German Nazis during World War II as a way of escaping, Soviet domination. So when you hear that word, that's what that comes from. So then on the 22nd, the Duma, rubber stamps the idea of using military forces in across the border. And on that day, Russian forces begin to, enter the breakaway republics, and they're starting to conduct military operations on a small scale. And then on the 24th, well, actually, even before the 24th, a number of cyber attacks are executed, denial of service and other things against the Ukrainian government and against banks and that sort of thing. And then on the 24th, the actual invasion begins in earnest. There are missile strikes and airstrikes throughout the country. Ukraine invokes martial law, orders general mobilization, and then Putin begins this declaration of what he calls a special military operation aimed at denazification and demilitarization. He, sort of amusingly pledges to respect the will of the people in Ukraine, and promises he's not going to occupy territory and he's not going to fire on civilians and this sort of thing. So, as you look at this map, one of the interesting features of this campaign is that there are four, sort of major lines of operation. The one that comes from Belarus and from Russia against the city of Kyiv as being probably their main effort up until very recently. And then there's the effort against Kharkiv, the effort against the Donetsk and Luhansk area, and then coming up from Crimea, this fourth line of effort that ends up taking these divergent axes of advance, one against Mariupol, one that's going north, and then one that's kind of going northwest, ultimately perhaps toward Odessa. In terms of the military units used, in the north, we saw a number of large units, the 41st Combined Arms Army, 2nd Combined Arms Army, 36th Combined Arms Army, and the 5th Combined Arms Army, at least elements of all those, in addition to the Russian National Guard. And then later they brought in the mercenaries, the Wagner Group, and other units, Chechens, and so on. In the Kharkiv region, we saw the 6th Combined Arms Army, and the 1st Tank Army, and then later the 20th Combined Arms Army. In the Donbass region, a bunch of different units, but principally the biggest parent unit was the 8th Combined Arms Army. And then in Crimea, 3 Combined Arms Army, 58th, 8th, and 49th, again, along with other units as well. So those were the major units. Now, what was interesting about this campaign was that from the start of the invasion, you see this, what I'm going to refer to as, and maybe erroneously, but this is the way I look at it, they're kind of pursuing what I would call a FOCO strategy, F-O-C-O, a FOCO strategy, which is classic sort of Marxist, sort of a Marxist strategy. And what a FOCO strategy tries to do is very quickly move into an area with a militarized vanguard, with the idea that the population is so in favor of this that they're going to rise up in revolution as soon as they see this brave vanguard, kind of thing. Now, FOCO strategy is a communist idea. It's Marxist, okay? And I know that Russia is not Marxist anymore, but their strategic thinking, very much has roots in Marxism. And so this FOCO idea is apparent because on the 26th of February, the Russian airborne forces attempt to seize airfields around Kiev, and they're rushing units down on both banks of the Dnieper River, trying to encircle Kiev. And there's this idea that there's going to be a rapid regime change, and this is very much in line with what Putin had been bragging about, as it were, over the past several years. I remember him famously claiming that, if he wanted to, he could take Kiev in 2 weeks, or less. That this would be no military challenge whatsoever. And so, this is what you see as they begin. And, a lot of military analysts have questioned, if you're going to invade a country the size of Ukraine and try to get a decisive outcome, why would you attack in 4 separate axes that don't really necessarily support each other? Why would you do that? That's the Russians are being very much criticized for that. But one of the reasons, of course, is that there was this gross intelligence underestimation of the Ukrainians. And then you couple that with this idea that we're going to do a FOCO strategy. We're going to move in. We're just going to rapidly, show our military strength, and the people are going to come out in favor of us. So is the idea, and against these Nazis that control Kyiv. So that was the original idea. And from the 24th of February up until about the 28th of February, you see this kind of a strategy being pursued. But then on the 28th is the first indication that we get of an operational pause of Russian forces along all 4 of these axes pausing to regroup, bring up logistics, bring up the artillery, and trying to recover from their initial losses. And then on the 5th of March, there's another major operational pause by Russia. And this is the beginning of where we start to see some fairly serious, albeit small scale, Ukrainian counterattacks on the 5th of March. And some of these are actually penetrating all the way up, as you can see in this map, all the way up to the Russian border, which is pretty audacious, and pretty significant. But again, they're small scale. There's not anything, like division size or anything like that. They're all pretty small scale tactical counterattacks. And then on the 7th and 8th of March, analysts are very concerned because it looks like the Russians are advancing successfully to encircle Kyiv. And the idea is that within a couple of days, Kyiv is going to be completely encircled. And that was the prediction on the 7th and 8th of March. But then, very interestingly, I would draw your attention to what happened on the 9th of March, because on the 9th of March, we saw a brigade-size abortive attack, on the west side of the river, on the western side of Kyiv, where Russia launched this brigade-sized unit, and it was just kind of fighting by itself, kind of an isolated thing, and it was easily, thwarted. The attack, stalled out almost immediately. And that was just indicative to me, as a military analyst, that, holy cow, this is really amateur hour here. You would think that if they're going to go make a concerted effort to take the capital out, that there would be, the encirclement followed by coordinated attacks, coming, from every direction, and that just didn't materialize. And so also on that day, Russia admits openly that they're using conscripts, which is kind of a big deal, because that's an explicit violation of their own law, because they're not supposed to use conscripts outside of the country. And then there's this question like, well, did Putin know about this or not? And, now, of course, they're claiming that he didn't know about it. But in any case, by the 10th and 11th of March, the Russians are stalled in front of Kyiv. They're stalled in front of Kharkiv. They're continuing to make some, fairly good progress in the south toward Mariupol and other objectives there. But on the 16th of March, there's a great uptick in the number of Ukrainian counterattacks. And so this is starting to become, pretty noticeable that along the entire front, along all four axes, the Ukrainians are executing these counterattacks. So on the 19th of March, the Institute for the Study of War, which is, a really good source. I'm sure that most of you are consulting them already. If you haven't, you can find them on Facebook as well as other places. But on the 19th of March, the Institute for the Study of War announces that Russia's initial campaign has failed. I mean, it has officially failed. They were not able to execute the regime change that they intended to do. And so now, from the 19th of March on, we're going to start seeing a shift in strategy by the Russians. They are conspicuously slow in adapting themselves to this failure. There's a lot of sort of ham-handed, just waiting in place, bringing up artillery. This is when they begin to really shell civilian locations in earnest. And on the 20th of March, the Russians actually, informed their own population that this is going to be an extended operation, so get ready for the long haul here. And then on the 25th of March, you see the beginning of at least a tacit admission by Russia that it's having to adjust its strategy, because they announced on the 25th of March that their first phase of the special military operation is completed successfully. They've done everything they want to do in this first phase, and now they're going to shift their focus over to the Donbass region. There was a lot of discussion of that in Western sources. The question was, well, does that mean they're moving toward an off-ramp diplomatically, and they're going to sort of stop the war? There was a lot of hopeful speculation that that in fact was the case. But since then, we believe that no, that is not the case. Instead, what they're doing is they're kind of digging in, and they're resorting to these long-range attacks, missiles, artillery. They began to execute the missile attacks in the western portion of the country. I've seen analysts point to those missile attacks around Lviv and so on, and I heard General Keane today, or I don't know whether it was today, but I watched it today, where he was talking about, well, that indicates that they're getting ready to occupy the western portion of the country. And I got to say, I don't agree with the general on that. I don't think they have any sense of occupying the western part of the country, because they've been unable really so far to take any major city. Mariupol is likely to fall, but as you've seen, in the video reports and so on, they've had to basically just pulverize that into dust in order to take it, and their losses around Mariupol are horrendous. So I can't imagine that they're still believing that they're going to occupy the whole country. It just seems unrealistic to me. But there was discussion starting on the 28th of March that Russia may be aiming for a North and South Korea type thing, that perhaps they'll advance up or attempt to advance up to the Dnipro River and then divide the country into an East and a West, and there'll be kind of a demilitarized zone. That's, some people are suggesting that may be the case. But coming down to the where we are right now, it appears to me that the threat against Odessa is declining. There was speculation for a long time that there was going to be an amphibious attack against Odessa, but what we've seen instead is that naval infantry that was embarked on amphibious craft have little by little been taken off those craft and committed to the ground war, in the south there, coming up from Crimea, as the Russians attempt to compensate for their losses and replace their losses, and instead of relying on the conscripts, they're trying to bring in the better trained naval infantry and so on. So anyway, it looks like there are continued piecemeal attacks in the vicinity of Kyiv, 2 to 3 battalion task group or tactical groups and so on. But even that has begun to wither away, and what we're seeing more now is troops digging in and bringing up artillery. So that's kind of the chronology as I see it right now. If any of you have any questions about that, we can talk about the chronology. Otherwise, I just wanted to show you this chart that gives an estimate of casualties. There's a lot of stuff on this chart, but the thing that I would like to point you to specifically is this U.S. estimate of Ukrainian forces killed, the fourth line down. Now, this only goes up through 9 March, so it's kind of out of date. But this seems to me to be probably the most realistic estimate of Ukrainian casualties that I've seen. This one from the Russian government is total horse shit. I mean, I can't believe anybody would take that seriously, nor would I take seriously the Ukrainian government's view of it, because, they have a vested interest in not really admitting what their casualties are, and I wouldn't either if I were in their shoes. But the U.S. estimate here seems fairly realistic. And likewise, when you go down to Russian forces, this is most alarming to me. I got to say, Damien and I were talking about this when we discussed this on the phone, and I think we both admitted, and I will certainly admit, I was in the Army for 24 years. I was a trained planner. I spent a lot of my adult life thinking about Russia, in the Russian Army. That was the pacing threat back when I was in. And then since then, I've been at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and I've done a lot of, military analysis work since then as well, a lot of it on Russia. And I got to admit, I was very, very much surprised, by this performance by the Russians. I never would have predicted this. In fact, I was telling Damien that not too long ago, I was talking with a colleague, and I was, comparing the Russian threat versus the China threat. And I told them, well, China is certainly the up and coming threat, and they've got a huge population, huge economy, and they've got big ambitions for being a world leader and all this. But when Chinese talk about military operations, I don't take them as seriously, because they haven't really been out there and tried this stuff for real. I mean, the last time they really did any major military operation was when they attacked Vietnam. In terms of joint power projection, they don't know what they don't know, so I think they've got a lot to learn. But I was telling my colleague that, by way of contrast, the Russians are masters at this stuff. They really know joint operations, and they know ground warfare. And when they say they're going to do something, I believe them, And then this happens, with this Ukrainian war, and I was taken aback by it. I just am really surprised at their incompetence, and at these kind of casualty levels. I think that we can realistically focus on this number of 10,000 as being fairly accurate. And most analysts at this point that I'm listening to are saying that the numbers are well in excess of 10,000 killed. Not even just wounded, but killed by now. And that's very surprising to me, but that's where we're at. So, so again, where are we right now? Well, there have been no significant offensive operations over the past 48 hours. There's this talk about units withdrawing into Belarus for refit and redeployment. We do believe that Mariupol will likely fall, but with significant casualties. Kiev is not likely to fall. We don't think that's going to happen. And that, again, is a surprise to me. I would have certainly thought that the Russians could take that city if they wanted to, but they appear not to be able to do that, at least at this point. But here's the essential problem as I see it at the strategic level. The problem is that Ukraine has no way to end this war. They have no war-winning stroke that they can do because their military forces are simply too small. I mean, they can continue to do small-scale counterattacks. They can continue to, hold on and thwart the Russian attacks, but they don't have any trump card to play that wins the final trick. They just have to try to survive. The only thing that would be a trump card, it seems to me, would be if Russia foolishly does something that galvanizes the West to actually intervene on the ground. Now, if that happens, then all bets are off. Then we may, that changes the whole nature of the war. But until that happens, I just don't see Ukraine as having anything that's going to give them a war-winning final move. And so then how does the war end? This is difficult to anticipate because to me, this war is an expression of Putinism, and we'll talk a little bit more about Putinism in a moment. But Putinism is this idea that we've got to expand or die. We've got to redress the crimes that have been committed against the Russian people, and this idea is going to continue until Putin is overthrown, and maybe it may even continue until after he's overthrown. Who knows? But the question that everyone's always wondering about is, can Putin be overthrown? Is that possible? He has been preparing for that kind of a thing for over 20 years. And so he's not going to go out easy. He's going to go out hard if he goes out at all. So, this is what we got to contemplate. So let's talk a little bit about tanks and the question of the relevance of tanks. I'm going to just share with you that this question of are tanks still relevant? Well, I first heard that question in 1976 when I was an ROTC cadet. Because during that time, the Arab-Israeli war, the Yom Kippur War had been fought, and there were anti-tank, guided missiles and tow weapons and all this kind of thing. And so, the prediction was that anything that can be seen can be hit, and anything that can be hit can be destroyed. And so the day of the tank is over. Well, that certainly was not the case. And as late as 1990, I remember writing a piece for Army Magazine where I was responding to something they were talking about the imminent demise of the tank. And I said, I was at Fort Benning at the time. And as a mechanized infantryman, I love the tank, so we work with tanks hand in hand all the time. And so I was a big fan. And so I wrote an article to Army Magazine and said, I was trying to explain to them why the tank is still relevant and will be for the foreseeable future. And in response, in the next issue, this colonel kind of patted me on the head and said, well, that Leonard boy, he's a good guy. He's trying to be loyal to tanks. And I appreciate that guy, but he's just naive. He doesn't understand. Tanks are going to go away and they're just not relevant anymore. And the very next month, in August 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. And so all of a sudden the tank is centerpiece again, and we get the Battle of 73 Easting, and the tank is all of a sudden back on the front page. So we've heard about the demise of the tank for a long time. We're hearing about it again, and I got to tell you, I'm not trying to be old-fashioned. Maybe someday that's going to happen, but to my mind, that is the wrong question to ask. The question that we should be asking as professionals is, what about how are we going to develop and evolve our tactical system of combined arms warfare? I think that tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and combat aviation, that's all still going to be there. Obviously, the artillery and precision-guided munitions is going to be a big piece of the new tactical system. And as the big thing that everybody's talking about is drones. Drones are such the superstar of modern warfare for good reason, because they do confer a lot of advantages, if you have them. And when you combine them with intelligence, ground-based radar and all the different kinds of intelligence we have, you now have the possibility of flying out over enemy formations and, hitting them with long-range precision-guided munitions before they even get close to deploying. And that's really cool. We have autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, machine learning, cyber going on, information warfare. And so the question that I think your generation has to deal with is, what is our new tactical system going to look like? What is the typical battle going to look like? And if we sort of recline in this idea that it's going to be all drones and shooting at each other at long range, I don't buy that. I don't buy that for a lot of reasons. It's expensive. You're going to run out of munitions. It doesn't take into account weather and degradation of sensors. It doesn't take into account jamming and maneuver, on the battlefield. So I think that we need to really give some thought to developing new tactical scenarios that take into account all this technology, but integrate it in a way that shows real combined arms dynamics. I guess when I think about the next generation, one of the things that I worry about is that combined arms theory. We don't want combined arms theory to go away. We don't want it to atrophy. Combined arms theory is really what our business is, and it's what we really got to think about. And so when you're thinking about combined arms, I hope that you're thinking about things like battlefield reactions, and systems and unlike systems working together to cause the enemy to react on the battlefield in contradictory ways, because you're coming at him with so many different attack profiles that he simultaneously has to stay put and fortify, but he also has to move, because you're using different weapon systems against him. And so now he's in a contradictory position. He has to stay put, but he also has to move. He's going to die. He's going to be defeated, if you can achieve that kind of a dynamic. So, and my last little point down there about formationalist tactical warfare versus Napoleonic dynamics, this to me is the great concern, because, all the way up until really World War I, and even a little beyond that, you have a lot of formation-based warfare, where formations are out on the battlefield, and the job of the commander, the enemy commander, is to break those formations. If you break the formation and the formation loses coherence, you win the battle. But nowadays, we really don't have formation warfare anymore. With the digital battlefield, you don't see, columns and lines and squares and things like that. Instead, everything's dispersed, and so the big question is, how do you inflict defeat? How do you put incoherence and lack of integrity into the enemy's forces? That's the way we win. So we got to think about that. And I look to you guys, as the ones that are going to come up with these new formulas. So we can talk about that if you want. But when you're thinking about tanks, a couple things to remember. There's, in the combat development and material development world, what they're thinking about is, on the one hand, you have the cost to manufacture, man, arm, train, and deploy these tanks. On the other hand, the cost to destroy them. And so as the cost on the left goes up and the cost on the right goes down, that's when people start calling for the demise of the tank, because it's too easy to destroy them, it's too cheap to destroy them, and it's too expensive to actually put them on the battlefield. And so that's what's going to cause this question about tanks all the time. And so we got to figure out ways to reduce the cost of producing them, reduce their vulnerability, and increase the cost to destroy them. And that's the way you protect the tank for the future. And again, when we're thinking about combined arms contribution, the way that I think about it is, for any weapon system, what battlefield reactions does this weapon system cause the enemy to perform? Now, what I mean by that is, let me use like a machine gun as an example. If I have a machine gun and you have a dismounted platoon and you're crossing this hill, and I fire that machine gun, there's two things that I'm trying to do. One, I'm trying to kill some soldiers, but that's almost the small stuff. That's not really the important thing. The important thing is what everyone else does that doesn't get killed. What is their battlefield reaction against that machine gun? And what's going to happen is, when you're getting fired at by an enemy machine gun, you drop to the ground, you seek frontal cover, you return fire. That's the battlefield reaction that a machine gun causes. And when you do those things, when you drop to the ground, seek frontal cover, and return fire, the efficiency of my machine gun will go down. The ability, the potency of that machine gun will go down because you've reacted to it. But if I also have a mortar sitting there next to me, now I can start firing at you with, high explosive weapons. And now, because you're stopped and you have frontal cover, but you don't have top cover, my mortar is going to do better against you than it would have before, because mortars aren't good at hitting moving targets, but they're really good at hitting stationary targets. And so when I shoot that mortar, I'm going to kill a lot of people, but then I'm also going to create another battlefield reaction. Because if you're under the beaten zone of a mortar, what you're going to do is get up and move. That's what doctrine tells you. Get up and get out of the beaten zone. And when you do get up and move out of the beaten zone, the efficiency of my mortar will go down, because now I can't hit you anymore, but my machine gun will go up, because now you're a moving target again, and machine guns love moving targets. Okay, and so that's the combined arms dynamic that we're looking for. Battlefield reactions that other unlike weapon systems can exploit. And so that's what we always got to be thinking about when we're asking questions about tanks or any weapon system. So, in terms of the tank, the biggest threat in my mind to the tank is that our pacing threat is China. Because I keep trying to think about scenarios in which our army is going to fight against China. Where is that going to happen? And I start thinking about Southeast Asia. It's not really tank country. I think about Pacific Islands, not really tank country. So this is, to me, the great threat against the tank. It's a matter of scenarios. But thankfully, Vladimir Putin, attacked, and now the tank is relevant again, because he's operating in the Great European Plain, that's the world's best tank country. So the tank's relevant. But I would suggest to you that in all these pictures that we've seen, videos, that the Russian tanks that are dying there are not dying because the tank is not relevant. They're dying from a lack of good reconnaissance, lack of combined arms, lack of air superiority. They don't have professional NCOs like we do, and they lack crew training. And that's why those tanks are dying, not because the tank is deficient in and of itself. Damien asked me to just comment on the second Nagorno-Karabakh War. And, as you guys know, I'm sure you've discussed, there's heavy use of drones and sensors and long-range artillery during that conflict. And the drones, provide a lot. They're good for reconnaissance and surveillance. They cue artillery and airstrikes. They also often have onboard munitions themselves. In fact, there's some versions that are kamikaze. You kind of just fly them into whatever you're seeing there, and they destroy themselves and the enemy. But they also it's an interesting note, they also give an edge in information warfare, because once you actually start destroying things, you can fly those drones in and film that destruction. And then you send that back home, and it gets on the news, and everybody in the world can see the enemy's forces in flames. And, so that's a huge information advantage. And you see it during this Ukraine war as well. So it is easy for us, as I mentioned, to imagine a new tactical system that focuses, on these drones and the cueing artillery and all that. But you got to remember that if that is indeed a viable way of fighting, that it's going to give rise to countermeasures very quickly. In fact, the better it is as a way of fighting, the faster those countermeasures are going to be developed. And those countermeasures include jammers. At the lab, we work on stuff like that. How do you jam enemy drones? How do you commandeer enemy drones and just take control of them and use them against the enemy? How do you deceive the enemy so that even when he's flying with drones, he's seeing decoys, or he can't find you? And then, of course, there's counter battery weapons that we can use against long range artillery and so forth. But the other approach that I would use to defeat this method, if I can, is I would use velocity. I would look to doing large scale, deep maneuver that forces the enemy's artillery and logistics to displace. Because once the artillery and logistics are displacing, they're not doing the recon strike stuff anymore. They're just trying to redeploy. And so, the faster we can move, that's a great way to defend against, this recon strike kind of stuff that we're doing. So I want to just talk shortly, but I'm almost done. Talk about a couple Russian problems as I see them. It's interesting that we see these Russian division and corps commanders committing battalion tactical groups piecemeal rather than cooperating and massing. And why is that? Everyone's, all the analysts are asking, why are they doing that? And there's speculation that it may be because of logistical shortfalls, or it may be just training and leader development, that they're just not good at that at large scale maneuver at the division and corps level anymore. It's funny because they used to be the world's masters at it, and now they can't seem to get beyond a brigade operation. This odd thing of the commanders in the South attacking in three, divergent directions. It's kind of like the principle of mass stood on its head. These attacks aren't supporting each other in any way, and so what you end up with is three different directions and commanders in all three directions screaming for reinforcements. That they, I need the fuel. No, I need the fuel. And it's just a bizarre way to attack. Very strange. They failed to get air superiority, partly because of the West sending Stinger missiles and so forth. They failed to get information superiority, and this is another thing that surprised me, because my prediction was that as soon as they invaded the country, the first thing they would do is redirect all the servers into Russia, so that they get control of the internet, as they did when they attacked in Georgia in 2008, and when they did it the same thing in Crimea in 2014. That they focused on telecommunications, grabbing those places or destroying them, and then redirecting the internet, control the internet to servers in Russia. They didn't do that. They've been unable to do that. I'm sure they would do it if they could, but it's a harder problem now because the telecommunications infrastructure is much more robust than it was even in 2014. The soldier skills and discipline seem poor. We mentioned the lack of NCOs, which is of course our greatest weapon, our single greatest superiority by far militarily is our NCO Corps. It is the envy of the world, and I've been many places, many other countries, and spoken to them. And I always, as an officer, I would go to these other countries to speak, and I always would hope that they were going to talk about how great our officers are, how they admire our officer corps. They never say that. What they admire is our NCO Corps, and for good reason, because the NCOs are running the operation, and we are the world's masters in how to create an NCO Corps, I believe. They are, this odd thing that they're doing. Well, it's not odd, I suppose, but they're deploying these irregular forces, drawing from lots of different places, including now Libya, as I understand. They're going to bring some of them in. They're bringing forces from the bases that they have in Armenia, Georgia, elsewhere, to make up for losses. I mean, it paints a terrible picture of their conventional forces that they have to do that. And as I was talking with Damien, I got to tell you that I'm very skeptical, and maybe I'm the only one. I probably am, but I'm very skeptical of this business of the battalion tactical groups that they deploy. I was skeptical of it back in 2014. Although everyone that I knew of, all the intelligence people that I spoke with, we were saying, "Oh, this is so brilliant! It's so powerful!" These battalion tactical groups. I think that's weird. I think the whole system is weird, and the reason I think it's weird is because it smacks to me of cannibalization. That they're cannibalizing units from the parent division in order to form one good battalion tactical group, and then they're sending the battalion tactical group across the border while the parent unit remains behind. This is completely different from our, brigade combat teams, because we organize brigade combat teams deliberately, and it's not, we don't cannibalize to make them. But this battalion tactical group stuff, every time I hear about they're using battalion tactical groups, the first question I ask as a planner is, what are they leaving behind and why? I never hear anyone talking about that, but it seems to me what they're doing. And in my analysis of what's going on in Ukraine now, my skepticism has grown. I think this is a really bad system, and it smacks of a military that is poorly organized and trained and equipped. In my view, I may be proven wrong at some point, but that's the way I look at it. But the only thing I would caution is that, as bad as a lot of these things seem, keep in mind that nothing ever stops. The Russians are going to learn these lessons, and they are good at learning lessons. Even they can learn lessons, and they're going to learn lessons here. And there's going to be military reforms, as there have been in the past. They will come to grips with the fact that they screwed this thing up royally, and they will change. And so the question that you should be asking yourself right now is, how are they going to change, and when, how are we going to detect it? Okay, so I'm very much looking forward to that. So the argument of Putinism is this, the reason I share this with you is because, you should be thinking in part about the information war that's going on. And so if you ever wanted to try to sit back as a critical thinker and ask why Putin is doing what he's doing, let's try to think like he thinks for a moment. And it begins in the 13th century when the Mongols invade Kiev and Rus, and they stay there for almost 2 centuries, and Western Europe does nothing about it. In fact, Western Europe's kind of glad that they're there because it keeps the Russians under control. That's kind of the way Russia sees it. And so the lesson learned from the 15th century on is Russia must expand or die. And so this is why Russia begins to expand at this incredibly rapid pace all the way across Asia. That's why Russia is so big. They expanded because their thought was, okay, we have a neighbor over here in Central Asia. We don't know what they're about, whether they're going to turn against us. We can't take the risk. We got to conquer them. And so they conquer them. Now they have a new neighbor. Well, we got to conquer them too. And so they keep doing this, all the way throughout from the 15th century on throughout the 19th century, expanding until they're as big as they are now. Okay. And so that's kind of the way they think. Then in 1812, Napoleon's Grand Armée invades. And one thing you should do as kind of a way to think about what Putin's view of things is, call up on Google the order of battle of the Grand Armée, Napoleon's Grand Army that invades Russia in 1812. And what you'll find is it's not a French army; it's a European army. It's got forces from all over Europe, that Napoleon has conquered. And so, from the Russian perspective, this isn't a French invasion; it's a European invasion. That's kind of the way they look at it. And then, of course, in World War I, Russia's invaded again. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, what happens? The Allies come in to try to thwart the Bolshevik revolution. And then in World War II, Nazi Germany invades. And from Russia's perspective, the USSR saved the world because they could make the argument that World War II was won in Russia. I mean, that's where the decisive land battles occurred. That D-Day thing, that's great. It's a small scale operation compared to what was going on in Russia. Russia saves the world, and how are they repaid? They're repaid with the Cold War. Okay, and then the formation of NATO, and from their perspective, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Western powers, including the United States, promised us that NATO would not enlarge. What's the first thing they do? They reunite Germany. And so Eastern Germany goes away. Germany's now our number one enemy from World War II is now reunified, and then NATO begins its relentless march, to the east, all the way up to our borders. Now Georgia is talking about joining, and Ukraine is talking about joining. Finland, Sweden. This is just an attempt to encircle and destroy Russia. So that's the argument of Putinism. And the uncomfortable thing I have to tell you is there is some truth in what he's saying. There is some truth there. Shame on us that we didn't have policymakers that were savvy enough to realize that there was going to be a reactionary pushback against this NATO enlargement. And now we're seeing it. Now we're paying for it in spades. So, that's the idea of Putinism. And it's here to stay, at least until Putin leaves. And this is my final slide. So my perspectives, so I think Putin violated his own playbook. If you read Little Green Men, we talk a lot about the playbook. Back then it was called the Gerasimov Doctrine. That's since been discredited, as not being necessarily associated with him. But the idea of doing all the soft stuff and then invading with very small forces, irregular forces, the Little Green Men and so forth, that's not at all what Putin did this time. He organized a massive buildup. And when he did, he seemingly forgot that the world is going to watch that and react against it, as the United States did and Western Europe did. So I think he miscalculated very badly. And that was my claim from the start of this thing, that I think he has now painted himself into a corner, and it's going to be a mess. I don't see how he gets out of this and survives. He suffers from the disease of autocracy. As is talked about on the news tonight, we believe that he is isolated. His people are afraid to come to him. He's out of touch with what's going on. He's a victim of his own information operations. That Putinism idea that we just talked about, he really believes that stuff, and he believes it to excess, to the idea that NATO is this existential threat to Russia, when really it's not. but it is an existential threat to Putin because the more democracy is catching on, the more likely that it's going to catch on in Russia too, and then that'd be the end of it. So, as I mentioned, he tried a FOCO strategy. It didn't work. FOCO has only ever worked once, and that was in Cuba. And then after that, they tried it in Congo. It didn't work. They tried it in South America. It didn't work. It's never worked except in Cuba. But here again, we see it tried, and again, it doesn't work. He expected the same performance as happened in Georgia and Crimea, and that didn't work. So to my mind, it's very difficult to see how Putin survives this, but I have to admit, he's very good at surprising us. He certainly surprises me. And so maybe he will survive this and be president for the next 20 years. Who knows? But to me, that's difficult to see. And my last point is this. What do I worry about? What I worry about is NATO fracturing over the issue of sanctions. I am concerned that at some point there's going to be an off-ramp. Putin is going to pull back to some degree. Everyone's going to be mad at him, but individual countries in Europe will start relieving sanctions. And when that happens, that's the path back to normal for Putin. And as soon as sanctions relief occurs in any form, he's going to declare victory. And for me, my motto is no path back to normal for Putin now. I think that we should treat him like a pariah. We shouldn't deal with him in any way. And these sanctions should stay in place until three conditions are met. Number one, all Russian forces off of sovereign Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and Donbass. Number two, full war reparations will be exacted from Russia to pay for every life lost and every infrastructure damaged. And number three, Putin and his buddies need to be handed over to the International Criminal Court for prosecution as war criminals. And when they do that, then we'll talk about sanctions relief. So I don't think that's going to happen, but that's what I would suggest. And with that, I will stop and hand it back over to Damien, and I apologize for going over time. Okay, over to you.
There are no apologies necessary. I think I speak for the group. That was awesome. Tons of insight, great perspective. I've been writing things down the entire time. Thank you. We can move to Q&A. I've got a whole bunch, but I'd certainly like to give the mic to other people if they're so willing. And feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat box, and I'll call on you, or I'll read your question. Dylan, go ahead.
Hey, nice to see everyone. Sir, thank you for the awesome PME. This has been great. Big question I have is, obviously this has been going on for a lot longer than we thought it would. Ukraine's been holding out. What kind of battlefield innovations are you seeing in real time that have particularly, struck you as interesting or novel or surprising on either side? I know there's a lot of surprises here, but anything that particularly stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that really shocked me, I have to say, and this is at the strategic level, it's not battlefield, but one of the things that shocked me, and I was watching the news with my wife at the beginning of this thing, and they started talking about, shipping weapons into, military aid into Ukraine across NATO borders. And when they said that, I immediately said, oh my God, they're not going to do that. That's like, or if they will do it, but they won't admit that they're doing it, but now it's just become this, well, hell yeah, we're doing that. And we're going to continue to do it. We're going to do it even more, and I was surprised by that because I thought that, NATO, it tends to be pretty cowardly. And I didn't think that they would do that because that seems to me like, an act of war, as it were. So that surprised me. But then along with that, I'm pleased with the potency of the Javelin and Stinger missiles. I'm glad to see that they are working. But I mean, the main battlefield dynamic that I've seen so far, and I suspect that you guys know more about this than I do, and I'd love to hear your perspective. But the main thing that I've seen so far is incompetence coupled with initiative and patriotism, equipped with really good weapon systems that they got from the United States and others. And of course, one of the big weapons that's a superstar in this thing is that TB2 drone that they're getting from Turkey. Those things are, those are interesting. They're actually very easy to shoot down. In fact, a lot of them were shot down in Syria. I mean, lots of them were shot down in Syria, but they're also cheap and they're effective, and so I think one of the interesting things is how they're using those drones, effectively, and combining them with artillery and precision guided munitions. So, I mean, that to my mind is what comes to my mind. I mean, what do you think? What do you think are the cool innovations?
I think there's just so much about this that's kind of undermining a lot of assumptions that we had about the future of conventional war, or at least just tactical engagements. I think the one thing that's really, I don't know if it's necessarily an innovation, but it's just really surprised me is the fact that, we talk so much about the complexity of modern combined arms, integrating cyber and information operations, precision fires. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing here is literally, two guys with AKs or anti-tank guided missiles shooting at each other, or a guy in a, BMP-3 shooting at a T-72. Like that, it's come down to that. And I think it reinforces a lot of the validity in the conventional training that we're still doing across the force, that a lot of people think might be now out of vogue or of a past generation. So that's my big
I think that's a really important thing to note, and I think we need to make that point. And you stated it very well. It's a thing that I wrote about. I remember writing an article about this, and we talked about it at the lab quite a bit. Is this problem of hype? What I was calling hyper war. The idea of we're going to do things at the speed of light from now on. To cyber stuff and hypervelocity missiles and directed energy weapons and all this really high tech cool stuff. And I see all these things being talked about, but what occurs to me as an infantryman is, well, that's all great, but that's all going to play out pretty quick. You're going to run out of hypervelocity missiles, and those things are damned expensive, and they take a long time to manufacture. And you're going to run out of cruise missiles, and you're even going to run out of cyber, because you can do that cyber stuff, and then the enemy's going to respond to it and bolster their networks, and they're going to kick you back out at some point. And so all this hyper war stuff is very exciting, but it's going to be over with at some point, and then we're going to get back down to guts and good shooting, and like you said, and I do think that's true. When we talk about hyper war, what we fail to do is talk about the sequels to hyper war. What's going to happen after hyper war? If it doesn't completely disable the enemy, which is what we're hoping, but it's probably not going to happen. Well, then the enemy's still there, and we still got to fight him somehow, and it's going to come down to conventional stuff again. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying there. Yep.
One more comment, and that'll be it for me. But another just observation is, and it's in the same line here, is, all of these high-end, high technology tools that we're using that we just discussed, that's it. So much of it lays in shaping operations when you can really be very precise with your combined arms before the shooting starts. But I think what's really interesting about this conflict is, I think we all thought that Ukraine would be completely neutralized by Russian precision fires and cyber attacks on day one, and it didn't happen. And I think that points to if you can survive shaping operations as a conventional force through ruse or camouflage, concealment, deception, you have a real chance of then fighting the conventional, slugfest. And that all these assets are not a preordained, conclusion like we have been talking about them being. So anyways, I really appreciate your time.
I love that. That's very well said. I'm going to steal that. I love that. Yep. Good stuff.
Awesome, Dylan. Thank you. Daniel, we'll get you, and then Ryan, I saw your hand up. We'll get you next.
Sir, I'd like to mirror the comments from my peers about the how edifying your presentation was. So thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Speaking from legal background, coming from the Office of the Judge Advocate General, something that is maybe glossed over quite often when we're looking at planning processes and what have you, target selection, et cetera. And that's for all domains, is things like PID, and ensuring that there's also legal approval for any effects on targets. And the fact is, of course, that these battlefield situations, especially in peer versus peer operations, are so dynamic and they change so rapidly that regardless of the, outside of, let's say, hypersonic weapon systems, which, I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where we have instantaneous effects on target. The moment someone pushes a button, there's energy released on an objective. I think that's another component, that it's not just the weapon systems that may come into play or that people may envisage. It's also that human and the extrinsic elements and the rule sets that we impose on operations in order to effectuate other aims or reduce other harm. So I'm in complete agreement with you, sir. And I find, I find that, of course, I'm quite uneducated compared to you, sir, but in my education, with my background, something that struck me as very interesting was that in the early 90s with the so-called RMA, we saw the limits of that in short order in the mid 90s in the former Yugoslavia. And then when 9/11 kicked off, again, we heard all the old saw about air power. And then we had to deploy light infantry into the mountains of Afghanistan. And you would be better placed to speak to us than I, sir, but I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are about, has there ever been a revolution or a proposed sea change in the effects of technology or new technology on how war is fought that actually has come to pass? Because in my limited experience, the chattering classes have gotten it wrong just about every single time. And it comes back to, as you said, sir, good shooting, etc.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point, and it seems to me that where we need to be, where you and I need to be in terms of thinking about military theory, is the most unsexy place in the world, which is right in the middle, balanced, because the dangers are in the extremes. On the one extreme, you can be a Luddite. You hate technology, you despise it, you refuse to learn it, you refuse to accept it, and you don't want to hear about it. We fought the old way, and that's the way we're going to always fight. So you reject technological opportunities and you suffer for it, and your troops suffer for it. On the other side is the classic combat developer who lives in the, in the schoolhouse, and he's so mesmerized by every technology coming down the street, and he buys everything that the contractor tells him this thing's going to do, that he thinks everything's been revolutionized, and oh my God, this is a whole new way of fighting, and that turns out to be garbage as well. Where we got to be is in the middle, where we appreciate and understand, and we do the hard work. We do the hard work as professionals to integrate technology into our tactics. For the sake of our soldiers, we do that. I remember a poignant moment standing in the Antietam battlefield. General Sullivan was there, and we were all standing there, and he held up a Manet ball, a little conical bullet that they developed, at the time of the American Civil War. He held this thing up and he said, "Now, what did this little bullet do to our doctrine?" And we were all smart ass SAM students, so we figured out, we forced us to disperse, and we have to, longer range fire and do all this kind of thing. And artillery had to back up further because we could hit our gunners and all that. And he goes, "Wrong." What this bullet did to our doctrine is nothing. It didn't do anything to our doctrine. And that's why you're standing at the Battle of Antietam, and there's the cornfield where thousands of soldiers got shot to pieces because their officers were too damn lazy to integrate technology and understand this is a change in tactical warfare. We have got to adapt to this, or our soldiers will be slaughtered. That's what we didn't do. So on the one hand, we have to be technological masters, and on the other hand, we have to be experienced enough and skeptical enough that we understand that, this isn't going to change everything. There are still fundamentals in warfare. Guts and good shooting still count, and so, and the other thing I was going to just say to you, Daniel, is, and I'd love for you to comment on it, is the other interesting integration of legal stuff has to do with autonomous weapons. because in fact, the lab where I work, some of the folks there, and I'm not privy to everything they're doing, but some of the folks at the lab there, are contributing to major studies about the ethics and the law, the legal ramifications of autonomous weapon systems and that kind of thing, which I think, you guys are going to be, front and center of developments along those lines, because, at some point, an autonomous weapon is going to kill a civilian unintentionally. It's going to happen. And then what? Then where's the liability? Is it in the software engineer? Is he the guy going to jail? Is it the commander who deployed it? Is it the soldier? That kind of thing. So anyway, back to you if you want to comment on that.
Well, I should also stress that, everything I'm saying on this call is my own personal view and is not from the government of Canada and the CAF, et cetera, et cetera.
Because other lawyers might be listening, and then we're both in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. Lawyers are the worst. Trust me.
I know. My son's one.
And well, I don't want to take time away from other people's comments. I'll just say that the whole issue with autonomous weaponry is incredibly complicated. So I'll have to give you the old lawyer answer. It depends. But there's sort of two camps that seem to be developing in that regard. One is that the one is looking at the question of where in the kill chain does a human being reside, and then the other issue is exactly what you described, sir, which is liability and what have you, and the two are somewhat interlinked, but they're sort of occur at different points in time, both temporally and I guess operationally or legally. So my inclination personally is that you always need a human being in the kill chain, because there are too many variables. An autonomous weapon system, if you think about it, is no different than a human being. The only difference is that it's not a human being, it's a machine. But the fact is that the reason that we train our troops the way we train our troops, and the reason that we hopefully practice mission command. I don't know about you folks, but in my experience, mission command is preached far more than it's practiced. But we want that strategic corporal to have the maturity and the training and the experience to make sound decisions in a dynamic and evolving situation, precisely so that as the situation changes, as it evolves, as the variables change, that the decisions, the tactical and operational decisions made by our troops are in accordance with the law of armed conflict. And so until you get to a point in time where an autonomous weapon system is smart enough to engage in that thought process, at least to the level of, the reasonable service member, let's call them. I think you're always going to need, and I don't know if we'll ever get to that point, but I think you definitely need a human being in that kill chain, because without making it, without making an artificial intelligence that thinks it's a human being, how could you make an artificial intelligence that's able to weigh certain quasi-objective or quasi-subjective concerns under LOAC, the same way that a military commander does? When we're looking at proportionality and the amount of collateral damage that's going to occur in relation to the military objective, the importance of the military objective at hand in a particular strike or operation, that commander is making that determination in part because he is a human being who understands the value of human life. So sorry for the long-winded answer, sir. I'm not sure if that helped at all.
Good stuff.
I'm really enjoying this exchange. This is awesome. Ryan, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Sir, thanks for sharing your thoughts. It was certainly enlightening. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. You mentioned in the Death of Mission Tactics that information and technology have contributed to the downfall of mission tactics. Curious, based on what you're seeing in Eastern Europe and the character of war, do you still think that holds true?
Yeah, I lost a lot of friends over that one, but it's the, I wrote that deliberately to be provocative because I wanted to try to provoke people into, changing that mission tactics idea from almost a theological, statement into something that's more reasoned and reasonable. I would think that any, reasonable person would understand that if you're a let's say a brigade commander, and you're deployed in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, or somewhere like that, and you're like this with jungle, you can't even see your feet. I mean, there's jungle everywhere. There's triple canopy, all everywhere. Versus if you're standing in the deserts of Saudi Arabia and you can see your entire brigade combat team. I mean, you literally can see the whole thing, which actually happened to me, as I mentioned in one of my books. For the first time in my life, I stood in the deserts of Kuwait and I looked at the entire brigade combat team, and I could see every single vehicle of it, including the logistics and the artillery behind us. Now that obviously is going to affect command and control. If you're the commander and you can see your entire outfit, that's going to change your approach to command and control versus when you're, when the jungle's in your face like that. And so I think the MET-T conditions play on the degree to which we're using centralized versus decentralized command and control. I mean, the whole philosophy and values and ethos, of mission tactics, I'm a big believer in that. I've been a big believer since I was a kid in that. I mean, I love that idea of the dynamic initiative, sergeants and corporals and lieutenants doing their thing. I'm all for that. But as a little bit wiser, older planner, there's limitations to it. And there's a yin and a yang, a beautiful balance between centralized and decentralized command and control. They're both useful. If I'm using a centralized system and you're using a decentralized system, I'm going to suggest to you respectfully that I can synchronize better than you can. I can synchronize things better. On the other hand, what you can do better is react to change on the battlefield, and you can seize opportunities and surround me before I even know what the hell is going on. But you know what I'm saying? So I think that there's a yin and a yang there, and I don't like theological principles in warfare where this is just always good. This is the way we always do it. No, you got to adapt to the MET-T conditions. So I don't know. Is that a reasonable answer? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think what concerns me right now is obviously mission tactics relies on trust, and then with trust comes the authority. I don't know if the authority resides at the appropriate level to make mission tactics successful, and that's my concern.
No, I agree. And what I was trying to say in Fighting by Minutes was that you should look at the relevant intelligence, or situation awareness. If the situation awareness, the relevant situation awareness is down here at company level, then that's where the authority should be, at company level. That's where the drive should be. But if the situation awareness is up at division and corps level, where I, as a 2-star general or 3-star general, I can see the relevant stuff happening faster than you can, Captain, then I think that's where the decision making should be, because I can synchronize things at a bigger level, and I've got a better read on the government and other things. So centralized command and control is not always bad. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. Not all the time. Not all the time. There's other times there's room for initiative too, at the lower level. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So let's get Garrett and then Alex.
Again, sir, thanks again for coming on. Just wanted to go ask specifically about one of the points you brought up about 2/3 of the way through your presentation. You talked about the recon strike capability that the Russians have been advertising and then using pretty heavily, and that we saw too in the Armenian War as well. This is the first time I've heard an offensive solution to that problem. So normally with the recon strike thing, what is often preached is like, hey, like we need to work on masking ourselves, minimizing electronic signature, camouflage. And I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I think that is important. But your point about rapidly moving in to displace those assets, again, this is the first time I've heard that. Can you identify any specific examples, maybe in recent conflicts, where that was successful? So that way we can maybe put that in our toolbox.
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to think about it, in Fighting by Minutes, I did a chapter on move, strike, and protect, the little triangle thing, move, strike, and protect, and I try to make this point there because my point in that chapter was that any given military unit can optimize for two of those things, move, strike, or protect, but not all three at the same time. So when you're thinking about a recon strike outfit, what they're doing is they're using protect and strike. Those are the things they're optimizing for. And what they're not doing is moving, and they're not doing significant maneuver because they're maneuvering their fires instead. That's what the Russians used to say. We're maneuvering fires, and they came up with this idea of a recon strike complex. Well, the way to get beyond that is to move to a different theory of war, which is move and strike, not protect and strike, but move and strike. That's maneuver theory. And the idea with maneuver theory is I'm gonna accomplish the third thing, protect. I'm gonna do that implicitly. I'm not gonna do it explicitly. I'm not gonna dig in and cover myself and deceive and all that other stuff. Instead, I'm gonna move so fast that I'm essentially achieving protection through movement instead of through digging in, kind of thing. And it's what Patton used to famously say that I'm not going to protect my flanks. I'm going to make him worry about his flanks. And by doing that, I implicitly accomplish the protection of my own forces. Now there's a limit to it. I mean, it all sounds really sexy and all that, but there's realistic limits to it: fuel and logistics and recon and the exhaustion of your troops, and you got to pause sometimes. But in general, what frustrates me is that the Western solution, the American solution for a lot of these innovations in war, it always tends to be technological and defensive, and that frustrates me because, there's a way of war that we rarely do anymore. Like if you and I were getting ready to fight, and I don't want to fight you because I'll get my ass kicked. I'm worried about that. I don't want to get beat up. But if I knew that I had to fight you, one of the ways that I can do it is, when we're setting up to do the fight, I just charge in right even before the thing is supposed to start. I charge in and preempt you, and I'm already like on top of you and kicking you and trying to hit you in the groin and all this other stuff. Before you can even get yourself set, I'm attacking. That's the idea behind maneuver theory is don't allow the set to occur. So you specifically asked a very fair question. Can I think of examples of this? The answer is no. I can't think of an example because I don't know that we ever do it. I don't. But let me ask you a different question. Suppose that you're the guy that's doing this recon strike stuff. You're using your drones. You're using your artillery, precision guided munitions. You're doing it. All right. Ask yourself this question: what are the prerequisites for doing this recon strike stuff successfully? What do you absolutely have to have in order to do it? And it seems to me that at least in part, you have to have your artillery forward in range so that you can hit the targets that those long range drones can find. You have to have your logistics tucked up tight to resupply those precision guided munitions and so forth. You have to have electronic countermeasures, on your side so that you're not getting jammed and your drones aren't getting commandeered and that kind of thing. So what I would try to do then is use maneuver to deny you those things. You start bringing up your logistics, I'm going to execute a spoiling attack, classic spoiling attack. Look up that term, because I know nobody uses that term anymore, but it's a great term. It's a World War II term. And a spoiling attack is intended to forestall an attack by the enemy. And because we know that when the enemy's getting ready to attack, they're going to bring logistics forward. Okay, I'm going to do a spoiling attack to displace those logistics, thus forestalling the attack. So I don't know. That's kind of my answer to it. If I were listening to you, I would think, the colonel's all full of shit. He's just talking and I can't provide any examples. That's true. I can't because we don't really do things like that. At least in the American Army, we don't. But we should, I think. I guess that's my proposition to you. So. Yeah. No,
sir. I appreciate the honesty. And like I said, it was refreshing to hear something other than, just mass signature, which is always difficult because there's always going to be something. You strive for perfection, but that's pretty hard. No, I appreciate it, and definitely presented with the problem again in the future because it's obviously a topic that the Marine Corps is talking about pretty regularly. I'll definitely bring up that solution and work to incorporate it in.
Yeah, I think that we need to remember attack is what we're about in the infantry at the small unit level, because when I attack, I change the MET-T conditions. When I defend, I just have to deal with the MET-T conditions as they are. But when I attack, I'm changing the battlefield geometry, and that's the beauty of attack, is that I now have the initiative, and it's going to be my kind of fight instead of your kind of fight. That's what we want to be thinking about. So anyway, yeah.
Alex, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I just want to reiterate, thank you so much for taking the time tonight. I have a question, bear with me. I'm studying policy right now, so it's more policy oriented. But in regards to the more human element, because war, right, is just the continuation of policy, just by other means, do you think that the lack of general support, going back to more of the Ukraine and Russia situation, the lack of general support for the Russian military initiatives from just the general populace, and that's like demonstrated through like the conscription in the first place, but do you think that's depleted the tactical level to that regard?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of subtlety in that question, and I really like it. Let me take apart a couple things and try to answer it. First of all, you quoted Clausewitz there, that war is an extension of policy by other means. Keep in mind that when Clausewitz said that was aspirational. What he was saying is war should be an extension of policy. But he went on to explain that left to itself, war will go beyond policy and it'll take on a life of its own. And that's the great danger. Policy has to discipline war. Otherwise, like if you and I are arguing over a parking spot, I parked in your parking spot, and then now we're getting out, we're arguing with each other and, getting in each other's face. Well, then we start throwing punches. And after a while, it's no longer about a parking space. It's about my pride, your pride, and then other people get involved, and it's like, what the hell are we fighting about? And then somebody takes a gun out, and it's like, boy, that really escalated fast. It became no longer an expression of policy. It became its own thing, horribly violent, kind of thing. And that's so, and I say that because that's what we're in danger of seeing in Ukraine now. There was a policy behind this invasion, and then that policy failed, and now Putin is going to stay there just out of inertia and out of fear that he doesn't want to get thrown out of office. So yeah. So anyway, that. But your point, I really like your point though, that Putin's sort of inability to inculcate and develop and cultivate this militaristic idea within Russia led to a lack of personnel and therefore to conscription. And conscription, the nature of the conscription, because as you guys I think well know, the difference between a Russian conscript and a Russian professional soldier is huge. I mean, in terms of pay alone, it's ridiculous. I mean, they pay those conscripts virtually nothing, and they treat them like shit too. So it's like, the conscripts are not very happy, kind of people. And so your question then is, how does that affect their tactical performance? And I think you're right on the money. It deeply affects that tactical performance, and that's why you see conscript like things like, the video, I don't know if you saw it, but this video of a column of tanks coming straight up the road into this one little town. And by the time they close in on this town, like they started off fairly well dispersed, but when they got up to the town, they bunched up because that's what amateurs do. That's what untrained soldiers do. I know, because I was a mech infantry commander, and I always had to constantly reiterate, you keep 10 meters between those vehicles. I don't care what the situation is. Get those things dispersed, kind of thing. And good soldiers will do that, but conscripts, they don't get it. They kind of bunch together, as conscripts will do, and then they get hammered by artillery. So I mean, your point I think is well taken. However, one thing that sticks in my mind about it though is, you were saying that the whole idea isn't well thought of within the Russian population. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Part of me believes that. The other part of me believes, Putinism is alive and well within a larger part of the population than I would like to admit in Russia. There are a lot of people in Russia that are at least friendly to the idea of Russian resurgence, that feel pissed off about what happened to the Soviet Union, and the arrogance of the West and the NATO enlargement, sort of taking advantage of them when they're down. There's a lot of people in Russia that are mad at the West and that are willing to listen to that Putinism idea, at least until it starts to hurt. And that's why we're doing these sanctions, so that hopefully they understand, yeah, there's a lot of pain there. I'm not sure I believe in it that much. I'd rather eat than have my pride appeased, kind of thing. So anyway, long, goofy answer to your question, but I mean, I like what you said. I agree with what you're saying there. The conscript nature of the Russian army is a very serious drawback. And to take your thought one step further and skin that onion back a little bit more, because of the limitations of the conscripts, they're having to bring in guys like the Wagner Group and Kadyrov's Chechen folks and all these criminals, and stuff. And so the problem with that is that once you bring those kind of people in, you own whatever they do. And we know what they do. They are murderers. They are rapists. They are nasty people. I mean, they are criminals that are being employed by a criminal regime. And so that's going to become an issue the more they start relying on those kind of people as well. So I probably didn't answer your question at all, but I think it's a cool question. I really like the idea that you're saying there. So I don't know. Did I answer it at all? Come close?
Yes, sir. That was really helpful. I think sort of what you were getting at towards the middle there about the general pain that like a common Russian civilian is feeling from simply just the sanctions alone. I think that's kind of more the perspective I'm taking now, is like businesses are crashing and people are struggling to just survive as just like on the stance of a regular civilian's daily life. They're looking back at some of these policies and war tactics that I think makes them question the desire to be involved in such a conflict, because like we're talking about like the cost benefit analysis there, like is it really worth that? But thank you, so that was helpful.
But the question is that we got to worry about is it going to make them question and potentially overthrow Putin, or is it going to make them more pissed off against the West, and Putin's going to say, see, I told you, they hate us, they're trying to destroy Russia, that's the way they are, kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean, it's a really cool question. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I would think that I probably put most of my hope in the oligarchs, because from the beginning of Putin's rise, he's been fighting oligarchs. I mean, we think of them as his allies, but the first thing he did when he came into power was slap them down and put a couple of them in prison, and actually took the whole business and everything of that one. I can't remember the guy's name now, but he just took one of those oligarchs that was trying to stand up to him. He took his business, threw him in prison, and he died in prison. And Putin did that in order to show the rest of those guys, I am in charge. I don't listen to you, you listen to me, kind of thing. So, maybe the oligarchs will be the ones that overturn him eventually. I don't know, we'll see. But yeah, it's a great question.
All right, I don't see any other questions or hands raised, so I'll take the liberty to ask one, sir. I imagine that you have seen the spate of articles, or at least caught wind of the debate going on both within and outside the Marine Corps about Force Design 2030 and how Ukraine is being used as a data point to either validate or invalidate the direction that the Commandant of the Marine Corps is taking the organization. Could you comment on, one, what you think about Force Design 2030, and do you, of what you know about it, does what we're seeing in Ukraine validate or invalidate the decisions that the Commandant has made with respect to getting rid of tanks, reducing towed artillery, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about it. I do have a lot of Marine colleagues at the lab, and we do a lot of work with Marine Corps at the lab, but I haven't been, especially privy to it lately. I don't know. My sense is, kind of like off the top of my head, is that I understand the force design idea, and I understand the walking away from tanks idea. It's a little hard to take, for me, because I'm a mech infantryman. So, that was a little hard to take. But at the same time, it does sort of increase the distinctiveness between the Marine Corps on the one hand, the Army on the other. And I think that in a Ukraine type, or really, in a European type fight, I got to be careful here because I don't want to wander into classified stuff. But well, let's just say that when you think about the plans that we have for fighting in Europe, I think that the Marine Corps part of that plan can easily be accomplished, under the Force Design 2030, idea. I think that works. And the Army's contribution is entirely different, I think, to a lot of those plans. So I certainly don't want to see the Army walk away from tanks, but I think that the Marine Corps, I think, can safely do that and still be relevant in Europe, and certainly relevant in Indo-Pacific. And if we're going to be true to what our leaders are telling us to do, the pacing threat for the future is not Russia. It's China, and it should be China. China is the up and coming threat to the world. They have a real huge population. They have a real robust economy. They have a very old and thriving culture. Whereas Russia, I've seen demographic predictions of Russia that are very bleak, in terms of the alcoholism that's there, the low birth rate, the fact that there's so many other nationalities within Russia. I heard one guy comment that there won't be any Russians anymore 20 years from now. I mean, which is obviously an exaggeration, but the point is they have a minuscule economy compared to China and to us. They've always had a problem since Peter the Great of trying to figure out how they're going to fit into Europe, and they haven't solved it yet, and Putin hasn't solved it yet. So I mean, I just think of Russia as they're dangerous, they're nuclear, they can do some things with their military, but China is really the threat. And if China is the threat, then Indo-PACOM is the theater. And I think that I would rather have a Marine Corps that is light, fast, agile, airborne, capable of moving quickly, being competitive in the electromagnetic, spectrum, that kind of stuff. And I don't really see a role for tanks very much in the Indo-PACOM. I mean, I'm sure there's places that they could be relevant, but so I mean, I guess I'm saying a long-winded answer to say I'm relatively friendly to the ideas of force design for the Marine Corps. I don't want to see the similar kind of thing in the Army, but I do want to see it in the Marine Corps. I think that's okay. What do you think about it? I'm curious. Are you in favor of it?
I won't give away too much of my hand, but I'll try to answer with a question, and that's, I guess, a statement then a question. And the statement is some detractors of Force Design 2030 have pointed out states with nukes don't fight each other. I think it's only happened once. I think India and Pakistan had a very short conflict. What was it, over the Kargil? It was the Kargil War, but that's kind of a non-starter for a lot of people, that we're gearing up for a fight with an opponent where the danger of escalation is so great that maybe we wouldn't fight them at all, and that the future of war. I know you're very familiar with Bill Lind and the fourth generation warfare, whether you want to call it coin or lick or whatever, and that if we were to fight China, it would take that sort of nature, right? It would be fighting in Africa, or it'd be fighting in South America, or fighting in the Philippines, or whatever. So I'm curious to get your take on that. What is the likelihood? So let's say that China is the threat, Indo-PACOM is where we need to focus. Is a conventional response the appropriate one? And is it also the most likely to be used in a conflict with China?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I always thought that developing scenarios for Indo-PACOM is challenging. I mean, other than the big elephant in the room, which is Taiwan. Obviously, if that becomes an issue, which is primarily a naval and air war, although it could easily become a land war as well. But yeah, the thing though, the idea that you said there that nuclear powers, or at least there's a theory that nuclear powers won't fight each other. That is a theory, and I mean seemingly it's a theory that has some history behind it, but it is a theory even among nuclear people, because we have I've worked the nuclear side at the lab, and we have some world-class nuclear experts there, and they would even tell you that they're skeptical of that theory now, and we may be seeing that theory playing out in Ukraine, in the very near future. Who knows? But yeah, and it's the reason it's being questioned is because of the existence of things like tactical nuclear weapons and other conventional weapons that can create nuclear-like effects and kind of things. So that from that type of theory, they're sort of downplaying the deterrent relevance of nuclear weapons. So I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I do think that preparing ourselves for proxy wars in Africa, I think is wise and likely to happen. I do believe that. I know that there are developers that bend over backwards trying to make a case for the Army in a Pacific war where we're sitting on islands and we're shooting artillery out into the ocean. And so I mean, and they're very serious when they talk about this stuff. And I don't mean to laugh at them, but every time I sit in on one of those meetings, I'm thinking like, my God, you guys are bending over backwards to put the Army in the Pacific, but I just don't, I don't know, it just doesn't really seem important to me, But yeah, I think proxy wars are real. And, I mean, I could see us fighting in Vietnam. I could see us allying with Vietnam against China, or Singapore, So I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not answering very well. I'm just sort of yammering, but yeah, it's interesting stuff. I saw a hand.
I'll be right back. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sir, just along the lines of what you were just saying, what are your thoughts about the need for a balanced, shall we say, non-optimized force structure? And I understand that the Marine Corps is the nation's force in readiness as opposed to the Army, which has a different role than the Marine Corps. And I'm not going to pretend to remotely be as learned on the Marine Corps force, let's call them renovations, that were just referenced. But is there not perhaps a danger of being too optimized for the next war? And then what happens if your projections are wrong? I mean, what are your thoughts about that, sir?
Well, I mean, the problem there is, theoretically what you're saying sounds good, and and there's some merit to that. But the problem comes down to budgeting and programming and technological development and force development, because when you get into the world of force development and that kind of stuff, you have to justify budgets. You have to, you are forced by the nature of the process. You're forced to contemplate and demonstrate scenarios, to justify weapon systems and to justify force structure. And so you don't have the option to go in front of Congress and say, well, we just need this. We need this end strength in the Army just because. No, what we have to do is we have to go there with scenarios that show 2.5 wars going on in specific places and where we would put divisions and corps and brigades. And so we have to contemplate scenarios, and we do that in response to the SecDef, who comes out with a national defense strategy. And in that defense strategy, he is going to specify what the pacing threat is and what the main threats are that we have to answer to, so, and then the chief, the chief comes out with his national military strategy, and that responds to the defense strategy, which in turn responds to the national security strategy of the president. And so all these are very scenario driven ideas, that we have to use in order to develop the force. So I like what you're saying, the idea of being flexible and, having a force that can do everything or anything. But at the same time, the reality is we have to optimize against what we think the most important threat is. And right now it's China. So
Sorry, sir. I apologize because I may not have elucidated my idea as clearly as I would have liked. I wasn't suggesting that you should have some sort of all singing, all dancing, force. That obviously there needs to be some, as you said, sir, some, you have to align the force that you're trying to build against whatever potential threats there may be. But my understanding, sir, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Marine Corps is either in the process of or has removed all of its armor. Is that a fair statement?
where they're moving. I don't know if they're all gone yet, but that's where they're moving. Yeah.
It's
Yes,
they're
sir.
all
So-
gone.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So in light of that, I guess what I'm asking is not about whether to optimize or not, but what I'm asking is there such a thing as too much optimization? Obviously, there has to be some degree of it, but with regards to the issue that Damien raised, I'd be curious to know your thoughts of whether you think the Marine Corps may be optimizing too much, because that's one theater or potential theater of operations. The Marine Corps, is the Marine Corps expecting that that's it may be the most likely theater of operations, but is it wise to tailor your an entire branch of the U.S. Armed Forces to one specific prospective theater? I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, I mean, again, and we can't wander into classified stuff, but the role that the Marines would play in a general European war, I mean, my sense is that they can do that role. I can't, I don't know how to say it. I can't really say this, but I mean, knowing where they're going to be, in those plans, I think that they can do what they need to do with this force design idea. The advantage there's a lot of like implicit advantages to getting rid of armor. And again, you're talking to a mechanized infantryman. I love armor. I love tanks. I believe in tanks. I freaking love them. In fact, when we're done playing here, when we're done with this tonight, I'm going to play World Tanks as soon as I'm done. Okay, I love tanks. But there's an advantage to not having them in the force. And the advantage is now you don't have the burden of crew training on tanks, and you don't have the burden of tank ranges that you have to maintain, and the burden of constantly updating software systems on M1 tanks, and all that kind of stuff. So that leaves the Marine Corps free to look at emerging potentially more relevant technologies, that I think it's a good thing, because the Marine Corps, in my estimation, and I hate to say this as an Army guy, but in my estimation, the Marine Corps is the most innovative, thinking, imaginative force in the U.S. military. They're way ahead of the Army on thinking about maneuver warfare and associated topics. So I kind of like the idea that they're being set free from the tyranny of the tank and more allowed to think about emerging futures, technologically and tactically. So anyway, that's kind of what I think about that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. Absolutely.
Sure, I think we will call it here if that's all right.
Okay.
With you. And just on behalf of the group and the society and the folks who are going to watch this, thank you so much. This was outstanding. I'd love to have you back if you'd be open to that.
Happy to. You have to. Thanks for thinking of me. Make an old soldier feel good.
We appreciate it. So thank you again. I'll stay on in case anybody has any questions or anything like that, but feel free to check out.
Okay. Yep. Go get some dinner.
All right.
Get
Thank you
cold.
again, sir.
Okay. Good night, guys.
Night.
Thank you, sir.
Damien, thank you so much for organizing this.
My pleasure.